I'm going to give two talks tonight, and talk as a kind of micro talk and a macro talk. And it'll follow a little bit about to use the trajectory of what I think we've seen in our own work in the last 20 years, say, and this transformation that happened in our work, and then play that against a longer historical transformation about the development of a kind of way of looking. So I start with this picture because about a year and a half ago, Kanye West, the musician, sent this picture to me and said, I want to build a theater for a 7-screen movie, and can you help me? And how it ended up that Kanye West called me to help him make a 7-screen theater is sort of the theme of the story, and sort of how we got there. And you know, when we started, there's 3 of us, Georgie, Stout, Susan Sellers, and me, and we were working in New York in a loft and just basically getting whatever work we can. And we started doing this magazine by chance called Any Magazine, which is Architecture New York. And Architecture New York was, in a way, the perfect first project because there's almost no money and almost no one read it. So you were totally like invisible, really, and you could do what you wanted. And so it became, one of the colors, usually pale. Are the Prestige guys here still? Yeah. And I don't know if it's possible as we go along to make the color better, because there's almost no color at this moment, which would be disappointing. And Any was this thing which is almost like this printed sketchbook for us, where every 2 months we did something and we were kind of trying to invent a kind of typography that was just like this exuberant, expressive way of thinking about architecture on the page. And at the same time, we started to do it's colorful, but not at all the colors that it actually is. the bottom one, anything is bright pink, and the ink house is bright orange. So that gives you an idea of how far off the road. So maybe there's something like the pins are turned around or something. So, and we were doing this series of books at the same time called the Any series, and every year there was one, and it was based on these different derivations of the word any. So it's anything, anyhow, anywhere, and this is. Okay, I'm not going to worry about it. It'll be kind of a black and white version of it. So, you know, the idea always was that any book was that it was about architecture, but it was really about the book itself and the idea of the narrative of the grid of the book. And so if you look at one episode, this is an Anytime book, and if you kind of look at it at this speed, and you start to see the formal structure of the book and how it transforms over time, you start to see a movement from left to right, the way the grid transforms and kind of propels the book forward in a certain way. And so I would say that while the content of this book is architecture, the content also of this book is about this forward movement, or the kind of narrative aspect of the book itself. And it became a subject that became important to us. And we've gone back to that kind of episodic narrative way of thinking about books many different ways. And so this is the kind of famous unpublished book by Rem Koolhaas on Lagos, Nigeria, which is a book about a 2,000-page book, which still sits in my office in one edition. And the idea there was that, you know, that every section of the book was a different book, and so if you took a whole bunch of books and glued them together, you'd get this one book. And so it's really a kind of episodic way of thinking about bookmaking. And that's true of this book that Alice mentioned, Multiple Signatures, which is the book I just published this spring. And again, the signature idea that, you know, a book is made of signatures, bound pieces of paper, each one has a kind of story to it. But it's also the signature as the mark of the writer. And so that each part is kind of composed by different people. I composed a lot of them, but sometimes with other people, and other people did things together. So it's a book really put together out of lots of different parts. And I would love you all to buy it, but unfortunately it's sold out, and but it's coming back in November, so go on Amazon then, please. So we were spending a lot of time making these books and thinking about books in print and its forward motion, how you moved through things. And at that time, because through Any and through some other projects, we started to work really closely with Rem Koolhaas at his office, OMA in Rotterdam. And we started in the beginning with them. Okay, this is another gray version of a very bright Las Vegas place. At the time, when we first started working with them, Rem had only built one building, more or less, and then suddenly started to win competitions, and we were working with them on the competitions. And so we started to go and work in space. And so we started to move from this propelling through book space into propelling through space. And this first project was the Guggenheim Las Vegas, which was 2 spaces in the casinos in Las Vegas. And so this is the Venetian Casino, largely made out of foam core. And then the OMA space, which is made out of Corten steel, kind of smashed through the front of that building. And you can see that the typography is rusted into the front of the portend, so you have this kind of rusted surface typography. And in the main entrance to the what was called the Guggenheim Las Vegas, or the kind of cruise hall space, if you're standing where I am, you're basically at a roulette wheel, and you're looking into this museum, and so you have this kind of frisson of the connection between the casino and the museum. And here we made this huge typography facade because we had no space in that building to work with, so the ceiling became a kind of facade with this gigantic typography that you entered underneath. And then you come into this big space, and there's this kind of big glass bridge where you're behind the letters looking into the space. And there, even the ceiling is etched with the Sistine Chapel, so you have kind of this weird Las Vegas sky coming through Michelangelo. And continuing on with Oma, we started working at this building in, again, imagine bright orange here, really beautiful bright orange glass. And this is the Student Center at IIT, and there, the idea was to create a space which was completely one story underneath the elevated train track. And so Rev designed this huge sound muffling tunnel that the train would go through. And the main entrance to that campus is famously designed by Mies van der Rohe. So the main entrance is a portrait of Mies van der Rohe, and then the doors open, you enter in his mouth. So you're kind of swallowed by Mies. And then as you come into the space, you can see there's these huge portraits that are etched into the glass in that space. And then as you get up to them, they break down, and you can see that they're actually made up of all these little strange icons of students basically doing all these different things. So there's kind of dissolution between the big singular image and the small multiple image. And the icons are all these kind of crazy things that students do, like headstands and getting drunk and cheating and stuff like that. So there's kind of hidden in there, these like little jokes. And so throughout that building, you get all these different ways the surface is treated. Here are these large-scale digital clocks that are in the polycarbonate walls. And then that led to another project with Red Pool House, which was the beginning of this project for Prada. And I'll now spend a little bit of time talking about that because it developed a lot of different projects from that. And this is a space in Broadway in New York. It's a city block wide, and he designated the north wall to be this wallpaper space. And that was at a time a kind of radical act because wallpaper is a non-architectural material. It's cheap, it's removable, it's it's faux in every way. And our job was to basically kind of reinvent that space by wallpapering it. And so we've done now, I think, almost 15 different things on in that space. And it's always playing the game somehow with the wall and the flatness of the wall and the way you move through it. So here, there's, you can see the walls actually made up these images of millions of people in a stadium holding up cards. This will come back later. These kind of fragmented pictures. And here we brought in, I think, 100 identical Caucasian mannequins from China, which has a strange robotic quality. So all the mannequins are exactly the same. So you have this army that kind of fills the space. And so you have this kind of combination of this army of mannequins and this army of people watching you while you shop. And then we started to think, okay, well, what do the mannequins do, when they're not working at Prada? So we created this world where they live in this kind of idyllic world of, fawns and butterflies, and they're kind of free. So the next season was like this kind of crazy world of the mannequin life, and liberated from their job. And so it continues on to be all these different games. In this one, we created a parallel brand to Prada called Gilt. And the Gilt has a branding manual, which is the walls of the space itself, and so everything that could possibly be branded with the Gilt logo, even a kind of Gilt mission statement. Or here, these huge, again, lushly colored, imagine your mind's eye, portraits of women who are notorious for their power, not for their beauty. And then the next season, kind of obliterating that with these strange masks that kind of lay over them. Or playing with the actual surface material of the wall itself, so kind of stuccoing on top of the wallpaper. Or here we commissioned 100 counterfeit old master paintings from an oil painting village in China. And the wall is actually made up of real canvases with real paint glued to the wall. So you have this kind of collage of representation. So the Prada project was this thing of thinking about space and thinking about the movement through space as in a way, the way we thought about books, but thinking about it in another form. And that got to be, because this building is bright pink, that got to be like another way of, this is in Tokyo in the Second building, where the images actually come out and kind of cover the whole building at different times. And so this kind of, again, integration of image with architecture. And this is the latest project we just did in Milan just a couple weeks ago for the women's fashion show there, where we hired and commissioned 6 street artists to basically actually produce the work directly on the wall, so rather than wallpaper being real paintings and kind of completely transform that space. There are 6 different nationalities. People are known for their images. So these huge portraits of women that become a kind of environment for the whole show space. And in a second, you can see where the people sit in the center and the show happens around you. And so that iconography then that developed for this, then becomes part of the show itself. And so to think about that graphic aspect of it, and then you see the image becomes part of the dress then. And so the kind of image comes off the wall, becomes part of the body, is kind of playing back and forth between the two. And so always playing again with this way that the representation wraps the space and then wraps the body and back and forth. And what happened working at Prada was that we started then increasingly going away from only print material and then into this world of screens. And the first space in Broadway, there were all these different spaces like this room with 23 little screens where we could create content, and that would kind of run through that space. And so you could watch a film where in 23 seconds you see every frame on that wall at the same time, but also see it moving, so you kind of see a film in still and in motion at the same time. And then all these other kinds of displays where you have these big different representations, and then taking those themes that we're working on and starting to build animation and action that happens in relationship to the things that we're developing in the visualization as well. And pretty much we're doing all of this on our own. We kind of just figure it out as we go along and making our own things. And here, a series of screens that kind of hang demurely between the clothing, and then you kind of come across them. But they're actually these mirrors where they do different things to you when you're looking at them. The screen is looking at you, and so in this one, it uses like a Japanese pornography filter, so it basically filters out your identity, but you only see in full resolution around the edge. Or in this one where the screen is actually scanning a single line of pixels, and then as people move in front of it, they're basically being captured on the screen. So you have a record of basically the people shopping as they go before and things like that. And then a whole series of different kind of ways of thinking about different kinds of motion in the way that fits into architecture spaces. So here was a project thinking about kind of an eye test project, kind of exercise your eyes. And here in Milan again for Miu Miu, sub-brand of Prada, a space which was designed almost as a video game. The models would come out and walk in front of these illuminated walls, and different things would happen. So you have almost like a kind of Mario Brothers landscape for a fashion show, and then it grows cactuses and things fall out of the sky like bananas and mushrooms and cactuses and for no apparent reason. And then in this space, a 360-degree projection space where if you think about the traditional fashion show is like a long catwalk with people on either side. And so here we compress it so it becomes intestinal. It goes around the room and people are sitting around the edge. And then all around the edge you have this projection. And so in those projections you have these two different forms of perspective. So here are Piranesian drawings which are still, and then over them slowly these kind of crazy, ghastly electronic flowers fill the room. And so you have to imagine this is almost 7 meters tall, so it's like taller than the space. So the whole room becomes this kind of crazy garden that fills over time. Or here, a project we did in Beverly Hills where we created a series of mannequins, and every time they come out of the darkness, their skin is being written by a different level of information. And so we're using a video game technology, so it's taking an RSS feed and writing the body with information. So the idea is that the figure is always new, and the idea of fashion is always about newness, and each figure is always rewritten with new information each time. And then that same theme here for a fashion show in Milan, where these very tall figures, again, were like almost as tall as this room. And as they parade through the space, all the data points in their body are growing and then expiring as they walk. And so they're kind of forming and deforming in all these different ways as they kind of move through space. And then continuing with all these different kinds of iterations of how to look at the fashion space in different ways, and this idea of army, multiplication, and repetition of these different forms. And so here, just taking one video and exaggerating it, and then even moving it closer. So here we're taking just a fashion show and looking at one line of pixels. So for instance, just the way that a dress or outfit creates a color, or something like that. So this is good. And this is a lovely color too. So all of these projects are kind of experiments in moving away from print into something that is electronic. And we continue to do that with all these different spaces. Here, a space we did where we have rooms of different qualities, one which is entirely foil, one room which is entirely filled with smoke, and so it's, all the wall surfaces disappear. And the structure of the room is then just defined by two different directions of light. You have columnar light or a ceiling light, and so basically it changes the form of the room just by lighting the smoke in different ways. And then this one, which is a space that has what's called a cover's ghost. So you have a video screen that it's transparent, so you're looking through it. And it's a little bit hard to see in this video, but you can start to see the sense that people are on either side of this. And so you have a sense of almost things appearing in space around you. So to show that in more detail, the idea in that space was always, and this starts to be another theme you'll start to see, is that we start to always think about the Z dimension, that always thinking about the flatness and depth of a wall or a space. And so we're always thinking about penetrating that wall in different ways or what can happen with it. And so here all the videos are weightless. There's things that float in space, so you kind of defy gravity in it. And then we did another project which is actually running real-time math and coming out of the DJ's board. And so it's basically creating shapes based on the sound of the music. And so again, if you think about the Z dimension, you're looking in space, you can see through this video, and it's creating these forms that kind of appear in space at different distances from you. So it's a penetration of that dimension, which as a graphic designer, you often can't penetrate. And then that's again running off real time, so it's drawing those forms in real time. And then continuing on this kind of creating these spaces, graphic spaces, which are defined by different graphic gestures. This is a project we did, a fashion show space in Tokyo, where the theme that season was about women and driving. And so we created this whole kind of roadside of signage, and the show was in a parking garage, so you kind of drove up through this kind of animated, roadside of all this kind of strange illuminated signing, and then that kind of leads you down this long corridor. Your car actually drives into the parking garage, and then you go inside this exhibition space that we designed, where it's full of all these kind of crazy, that Cadillac's pink. It's full of all these kind of crazy classic car spaces, kind of an exhibition space with these projections all the way around. And the projections there kind of, again, break that Z dimension of the wall, and so they use this driving perspective, and so you're kind of, again, looking into the wall, looking out of the space from this position all the way around you, so kind of surrounded by this visual elements. And then when you cross into the other room where the fashion show actually happens, it's the next day of the parking garage, you have this big space. And there we created these big walls where we made this film. I'll show you a few minutes of it. And it's this idea of women and driving. And the interesting thing about women and driving is that in a film that always means something's wrong. That someone's escaping from something happened, there's something that happened. And the other thing about women and driving is that, or any driving film, is that there's only a limited number of ways that you can shoot a driving film, and so you can edit that together very simply. And then kind of continuing on that driving theme and wall theme and penetration theme and other things. This is a project in Doha, in the desert, for the Doha Tribeca Film Festival. And in Doha, where the festival is, there's a series of dunes in the background and this long wall, which is almost like more than a mile long. And so we created, with Brigitte Lacombe, the photographer, this series of images that are almost animated as you drive, and that wrap all through the space. And so you have, like a mile and a half of material, basically, and then the motion of the car basically animates that action. It's, kind of, you reads out or reels out as you go along. And the kind of interesting thing about that is you'll see occasionally through these things, these big sand dunes in the background, but the sand dunes are actually fake, and they actually they cover parking garages, so you can go up and be like, you know, they're kind of really hard sand dunes. So it has this kind of really weird quality. And then that led to like a whole series of other really big scale projects. This in Shenzhen with Cool House again, the skin of the Shenzhen stock market, where the whole skin of the building becomes activated. Or in Hong Kong, the Chanel headquarters, where the whole building itself is a kind of video image, and where we create content which somehow breaks down that two-dimensional aspect of the facade, and always going, again, penetrating into that space and creating this kind of 3D area, this place, not either the facade or inside, but somewhere between those. And then kind of bringing back down a project we recently did at Barneys in New York, where to create a restaurant where the whole space was a screen itself. And so you have a series of places that are about 28 places where you can kind of manipulate all of these windows. And as you, so the whole space is kind of animated by this moving river of content. And then as you sit there, you can move it around, you can open it up, you can do things, you can shop while you eat. You can actually order your food from the table, so there's this kind of, very intimate relationship with the screen and with these windows, and kind of relationship of screen, window, content, etc. And then this project, which was at PS1 in New York, in conjunction with these young architects named Soil. And PS1 has a competition every year to do an architecture project for that big outside yard. And these guys did a very beautiful installation, which was to create a very weak piece of architecture. So it's a series of these very tall, white graphite poles that are about 30 feet tall, I think. And they're all linked together by a mesh ceiling, which just holds the whole thing. But if you pull on any part of it, the whole thing moves. So it's this kind of very unstable structure. When you lay on the hammock, half that pulls over, and that pulls all the way through the system, something happens. And so you always have this reaction through the system. And so it's a kind of thing to make an interactive space, again, with very little elements. And we created a project for that, again, a screen-based project where to create an app where it allows you to, by putting accelerometers at the top of the pole, it allows you to kind of manipulate what's happening by the motion of the object itself. And so the screen in your hand is being driven by this thing which is happening in real time. And you can do things like, for instance, you can make sound with the motion of the poles. Or, kind of importantly, I think that it's very difficult when you're in the space to understand what's happening to it. So you can visualize then the action of all the tops of the poles in these different forms. And so this is in real time reading the motion of the poles and then creating different visualizations for that. So it's kind of connecting again between the real world and screen world and back and forth between those two things. And so as you wiggle on that, then something wiggles on here and kind of going back and forth, always creating different ways of representing that. And then this last project was a project that we just did this spring, and it's a project we did as part of the design festival in New York called New York City Design. And we created this thing called Multifesto. And the idea is to create a manifesto which is written by anyone who wants to write a line of it. And it's always in this form of verb, preposition, and noun. And so basically it allows a kind of ongoing, growing design manifesto which is produced by anyone, anywhere. And so we created basically a kind of whole system around this Multifesto, and then that basically generates content that then can be sort of used as part of the design festival. And so we're creating this different language, and then that basically is pulling out into Times Square for the opening where it took over all the screens in Times Square, and you have basically this language which becomes part of the space itself. And so again, the screen is an environmental space that we're working in, and where this thing happens at this really huge scale, multi-story things, and becomes part of the language of the city for that moment in time. And then kind of to zoom back down, it's in 7,000 taxis in the city, so basically the same content is being developed, is being generated on taxi television, and so you have this kind of huge scale, public, small scale, private representation of the same idea. And so you have kind of constant regeneration of the content. And now we have about almost 1,000 lines of the Multifesto now, so it's kind of growing daily as more people discover it. So go to multifester.org, you can add your own into it. So that's the small story, and it basically is the story of going from kind of book designers and print designers to space designers and wallpaper designers and then environment designers and then screen designers, and then how that changes the kind of way that you work and the way that, not only the way you work, but the way you think about work. And I think that that's what the second half of this talk is about, which is this idea of this thing that we used to think of as solid as a kind of design melting away into something which is very ephemeral, and that loss of solidity, and the kind of historical trajectory that that played on as well. So I was struck by this quote when I started this project, which is that thinking about that perception is not only organized through medium, but it's determined by the history also, that our perception changes radically in these different historical moments. And I think that if we look at about a 100-year period leading up to this moment now, you can see that in the way that the screen develops as a form and as a phenomenology. And I thought also of these two phrases by a theorist on the idea of what cinema does, and this idea of the dynamization of space and then the spatialization of time. And that seems like the really essential aspect of sort of what drives sort of where we're at this moment. So this is kind of organized into these 5 chapters, and we'll kind of move through different parts of it. So the first part starts with in about mid-1800s with the invention of really large-scale plate glass. Because I think that if you think about plate glass as the first kind of screen in an urban sense, where suddenly you have these big frame tableaus that are graphically organized in some way. And so you have this kind of new experience of these big urban images, which can be changed, albeit at a fairly slow rate, but still changed, and so they're dynamic in that way. And Benjamin talked about these arcades in Paris with all these glass windows that went down along them, and kind of claims that glass was the kind of impetus for the invention of fashion, because suddenly you expect that all of these shop windows are going to have new stuff in them all the time. And so they start to become animated in that way, in the sense that glass becomes a frame of which things are animated behind. And if you look at an image like that, how much that is like a film which is animated by motion and by mobility. And so it's the motion of people walking through the city that animates a film like that. And so that's a very graphic image, right, where you have a series of images and they go one after another. And so it goes back to the idea of the book and the narrative aspect of the book. But the narrative here is driven by walking. And it also invents this trope, the window shopper, as somebody who kind of looks but doesn't buy, who kind of grazes across the surface of it. And so that has an equivalent, I think, we'll look at with the idea of the browser also, kind of just passing through and seeing what you see. And so if you take that first invention of glass and then you add that invention of electricity and a kind of urban scale electricity and the idea of electrified type, you start to kind of zoom in on this idea of the screen as an urban type. I always love this image because it's like the perfect combination of brands, I think. You have Eiffel Tower and Citroen, and it kind of like fit perfectly together in space. But if you look at like these early pictures of Coney Island, and it's about 1902, I think, the way that electricity starts to obliterate the architecture, it becomes an outlining or a structure which you see, and the architecture starts to disappear, and something else appears. And the next little clip I'm going to show you is the beginning of the film of My Man Godfrey, and it's, I think, a beautiful image of a kind of city of typography. Interesting here, I think, is the way that the architecture becomes kind of indeterminate, not important, but it's the skin of typography and of information that starts to become more important. And so, these kind of images of the city are really familiar now, where you have this perfect combination of glamour and advertising and electricity and light, and all those things kind of make up the image of a kind of thriving city. So if you look at Times Square, this is about 1900, about 1920. The 30s, late 40s, and today, right? So you have this kind of, where do the buildings go? Where the proliferation of screen and of graphic becomes the environment that these things happen in, and where you operate in this environment of screens, not necessarily an environment of architectural space, but of graphic space. And that's true if you ever walked out of the not nearly as blue and yellow as this, but out of the subway station in Shibuya in Tokyo, where you're just struck by this wall of imagery and of light and of motion and of graphic and of advertising. And again, you can't really tell where one building begins and the other ends. It becomes one mass of graphic component. Or even a kind of small-scale street in Hong Kong where the signs actually leak into the street itself. You know, there's no corridor anymore. The graphic becomes a kind of mass in that case. And then if you add on to that electricity plus glass plus typography, and then you add speed, so now you start to animate it, right? So you have this kind of the motion of the car, which then creates even the film starts to go faster. And there's this beautiful film made by Kevin Lynch at MIT of just a different way of looking at Cambridge in 1950, you know, with just this, you know, at this speed, looking out the front of the car, like the screen, the windshield of the car becomes the screen. That's the way you understand things. But these are still all essentially propelled by mobility. They're about motion forward and about the way that one image comes after another. So you're constantly looking at a series of views which are narrative in that way. And that's what Vittori was talking about when he sort of made these diagrams about the change in the highway, where, you know, for a pedestrian society, you can have the little building at the top, but for a driving society, the signs become perpendicular to the street, and the car is what propels it. So you dissociate the building from the sign. It becomes a series of one after another events. And so this idea of kind of one thing follows another, and that's the narrative of moving forward. And that trope of mobility, that forward motion that drives all of that stuff we've looked at, you know, kind of continues in the classic, you know, single-point shooter mentality, which is that you're pressing into the world, and things happen around you, but it's mobility that is the engine to that. So you're surrounded by stuff all the time, and then it's your motion through it that animates that stuff. So if you take that thing about being surrounded by stuff, but the stuff that we make as designers, I want to make a brief detour now into the sort of the worry about that, because there's an attendant fear about being surrounded by stuff. And I start off with this image, a very beautiful image from Terry Gilliam's film Brazil, where it has this highway, a kind of dystopian universe, where the highways line on either side with these crazy advertising images of blue skies and mountains and everything. And then just on the other side of that thin surface is desolation. You know, so the graphic designer makes this really thin image that wraps the glories of the world. And so that thinness and that idea that something is not being revealed but being hidden is an important part of the screen too. So when you think about the screen not only being something that reveals but hides in that way. And I was looking at these images we took in China, where, you know, in the streets, oftentimes where the developments are, you have this view of the city that's going to be in the future, and it's almost like an exact perspective to the street, so you can almost like just step into this new world, you know, this kind of real estate utopia. And again, you're surrounded by these images all the time, and what are they saying or what are they doing? And the next clip I'm going to show you is from a famous John Carpenter film, you probably know it, called They Live. And you know, to set it up, Roddy Piper is a guy who finds this pair of sunglasses, and the sunglasses allow him to see through the graphic part of the world into something else. So there's this beautiful image of the city here where he looks at the interface of the city is just full of commands on what to do, right? Like watch TV, consume, stay asleep. You know, you're surrounded basically by orders or control. And this goes on, but of course it turns out that it's all an alien plot. So it kind of neatly knits together these two conspiracy theories, which is subliminal advertising and alien infiltration. So you have them like perfectly combined. But of course, subliminal advertising, the point of advertising is that it's not subliminal, right? It's just like, it's there. So you're kind of, you're in the shadow of it all the time. And so you're surrounded by these images, by these screens at all times that are revealing something and telling you something. And the point isn't to hide it, the point is to flaunt it. And that takes on this kind of extreme turn in this Tom Cruise film, Minority Report, if you remember it, where the ads actually recognize who you are and start to talk to you.
A road diverges in the desert. Lexus. The road you're on, John Anderton, is the one less traveled. Make sure you go on your
Stressed out, John Anderton.
So this is not so different from Google Mail, right? Someone knows what you're doing and they're being marketed to. So, and it's not so different than being on the street because you are being watched, obviously, and there's information that's being sent all the time. And one of the things that recently came out in the whole NSA thing is that they've perfected now the ability to do facial recognition in crowds, so you can be spotted almost anywhere. And so this aspect of you're in public, you're surrounded by things, but you're also getting information taken from you as well. So that leads us to chapter 3, and this idea of the screen itself as kind of the form of the screen itself and the power that it projects. And so if you think about the cinema, which is only a little bit over 100 years old, and these early huge-scale experiments, the Lumiere brothers and early pieces, so if you look at those are people and the scale of that screen, that already the idea of the big screen and the power of the big screen is something that from the very early parts of cinema starts to become significant. And so you think about that space that's created, where you're fixed, there's no longer mobility. The mobility becomes virtual, right? So as you are now, you're sitting here and the things change on the screen. And so it's an absolute reversal of the early moment where if the glass window was only propelled by your motion, now you're fixed and then the motion all happens on these screens in these rooms in different ways. And I think that I always like to start at here because if you think about those cars propelling and moving through space in the way that animates space, here the drive-in movie, Patterson, New Jersey, 1933, the cars stop and the images move. And so there's this thing that happens where the screen brings everything to a halt and changes that relationship in this really fundamental way. And so even in this one, you can see the screen still has a kind of architectural ziggurat component to it. But by the 50s, it's just pure screen. It's just image in space. And it's all about the power and the scale of that image. And scale becomes really essential as the screens get bigger. And here, a beautiful image of Penn Station in the early 60s, John Glenn's space shot, first live television in public space. And this space, which is all about people moving constantly between spaces, everyone comes to a halt. And the screen becomes this powerful tool which kind of brings everyone into line and holds their attention. And so that is a really essential change in the way that we think of the image in that point, where the screen now takes on a power. And it's not surprising then that in these early films, people start thinking about the tyrannical power that the screen has. And so here in the H.G. Wells adaptation, Things to Come, the leader is a huge screen image that's projected, and you can see the people all below. The scale of the screen and the scale of the power start to be equated in some ways. And so, and there's kind of long tradition of the megalomaniac image, kind of getting larger and larger. This is Mussolini's headquarters, kind of the huge face, the famous portraits of Mao. Kind of the big image, the big face, the big screen, having kind of the diminishing effect of the size of the image in relationship to the size of the audience. And that sheer scale relationship carries with it all of this weight and all of this, again, kind of conspiracy to it. And so if you think about this, which is the famous image, what is Oz but a big head and a big projection? And so this idea of the kind of tyranny of the image, the tyranny of the screen that takes stronger and stronger precedent.
Do not arouse the wrath of the great and powerful Lord. I say come back tomorrow.
If you are really great and powerful, you keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the great Lord?
So of course that pulling away the curtain is the key point, right? Because behind the image there's always somebody literally pulling the levers of power, right? There's someone who's acting that. And so the big image always implies an apparatus of power behind it that's running it. And so the bigness of the screen is dependent on this whole infrastructure of power that drives it. And so you have, increasingly all of these images here at Ridley Scott's film Blade Runner in 1984, where the whole building starts to become motion picture, the surface of the building. And I always say this image basically launched like 10,000 architecture thesis projects because suddenly every architect wanted to make the skin of their building motion graphic. And so it changed this architecture space where buildings became screens in that way. And interestingly, Ridley Scott that same year made the remake of Orwell's 1984, where again, the classic Big Brother as big screen, and the tyranny of the image and the diminution of the audience in relationship to the face. But then all the different ways that you see that all the time, in terms of the image is getting bigger and bigger all the time. It's a strange combination between those two. But and then the scale of the image and scale of the human gets increasingly distorted. And so the screen has this kind of all-powerful effect at a certain point. So, but interestingly, in the same year that Ridley Scott made the remake of 1984, he made this film, this commercial, the famous one-time only commercial advertising the advent of Macintosh and the kind of the birth of the personal computer.
Today we celebrate the first glorious anniversary of the information purification created for the first time in all history a garden of pure ideology where each work may bloom, secure from the pests of any contradictory force. Unification of force is more powerful a weapon than any fleet or army on earth. We are one people. One resolve, one cause. Our hands shall talk themselves together, and we will guide them with their own confusion. We shall prevail.
And so, the tagline to that film was, "See why 1984 won't be like 1984." And it's interesting that he posits basically the birth of the small screen, the birth of the personal computer with the death of the big image, right? The kind of the demolition of Big Brother is something that is the advent of this new age. And so in basically about 90 years, you go from that to this, right? So basically, suddenly, again, a reconfiguration where now it's not about an audience altogether, but it's about individuals looking at individual screens. And that kind of reshapes basically the language again. So if we look at that in a little more detail in this idea of the small screen and the kind of advent of the small screen, it has a really interesting development itself and this kind of fragmentation of the image as being a kind of essential aspect of that. And it started here in 1927 with Abel Gance's film Napoleon. And Gance basically was one of the first to create this film where the whole film happened in the square in the middle until the last reel when Napoleon invades Italy. And these curtains go up and suddenly it reveals this screen presentation. And it's interesting, if you look at a little bit of it, what Gance said was that the story was too big for a screen at that point, and so he had to expand it. But also, you can see it's not just one big image, it's a fragment of images where you see many different things montaged together. So you push the audience not only to see this big shape, but also to put together all these disparate pieces and read it in a different way. And that's a really essential part of this development of the small screen, which is that it pushes you to not see a kind of single representation of the world, but this multiple thing that has to kind of recompose in your own brain. And if you look at that then a little bit later, in the 30s, this is Bayer's famous diagram that he did for this idea about exhibitions. But I think it's really one of the most important graphic diagrams of the 20th century. You have like this beautifully dressed eyeball who's is one's point of view, and then all of this array of stuff which is directed to you. And so it's not a single film like sitting in the theater. It's this new kind of film or space where there's a lot of things going on, and you are basically the one eyeball brain that absorbs it all in the ways. And about this time, you start to see a lot of these images of these control rooms where, now the guy who's running the television station, he sits alone in a chair, he's surrounded by the TV things, and he's moving all these buttons and controlling everything from this one point of view. And it's interesting, in 1954, Hitchcock makes this amazing movie, Rear Window, which I'm sure most of you have seen. But if you don't know it, the premise is that Jimmy Stewart is a photographer who's broken his leg and he can't leave his apartment. And you can only look out the back window of his apartment. And on the other side is a building with a series of windows, and different things happen in those windows. And it's interesting that that's right at the advent of television, right? Where now he's at the couch, he's watching all of these different screens, different stories are happening in them. And he has very limited ways of seeing that. So he can see with a telephoto lens or with his binoculars or his bare eyes. But so that's a kind of zoom effect. But I'll show you.
This is the apartment of a man named Jeffries, a news photographer whose beat used to be the world. Right now, his world has shrunk down to the size of this window. He's been watching the people across the way. Nobody seems to pull their blinds during a hot spell like this. He knows a lot about them by now. Too much, perhaps. For instance, down there on the second floor, the woman pacing about. He calls her Miss Lonely Hearts. So lonely that even death seems like a friend. These are the newlyweds, on a honeymoon no one will ever forget. He calls her Miss Hearing Aid, an artist of a very odd and strange art.
So it's just, if you think about those windows as screens, and the way that the screens capture certain kinds of graphic images, and the way that between the windows, the blank space is like an edit, right? So you have to go and figure out what happens when the character disappears, as well as what happens when they appear. So he's put in the position as the viewer, he's the eyeball, and basically all of these screens are giving you fragments of information, and he's basically piecing together all of these fragments to go and make up some kind of narrative again. So that's essentially a different way of thinking about how you absorb the world, which is that you absorb the world as a series of disconnected fragments, and the unity actually happens inside you and not outside in the world. And so if you go back then to Bayer and his eyeball, and then look at Eames, they create almost exactly the diagram in their projects for IBM. So where they create this think space, which is a series of these screens with all different kinds of things happening on it. And they're constantly changing, and the viewer is basically kind of absorbed by this flood of content. And they had done this project earlier in 1957, I think, in Moscow, in the pavilion designed by Buckminster Fuller and George Nelson. And they did a project called Glimpses of the USA, which is a 7-screen, huge screens, they're like 20 by 30 foot screens or something. And they theorized that basically the point was to distract the audience, to overwhelm them with information, and you couldn't do that with less than 7 screens. That if you had less than 7 screens, the audience still could kind of comprehend what was going on. But as soon as you got 7, they just gave up, and they were basically washed over with information. And that was essentially like the experience of the modern world, was to be washed over by information. And that's what they were trying to do, to kind of flood the space with imagery. And they had even done these experiments at the University of Georgia, where they even sprayed perfume into the air conditioning ducts and things like that, so you'd be overwhelmed with smell and everything. There would just be complete cacophony around you. And they kind of reenacted that in the 1963-64 World's Fair in New York City. The pavilion designed by Saarinen, which is this beautiful egg shape that actually has a theater inside it. And the amazing thing about this theater was that the seats were outside, and the audience loaded up on them, and they went up that big ramp. They were drawn up into the egg, and then when they were inside, they were completely surrounded by this screenscape. And I'll just play a tiny bit of it because it's interesting. And what's interesting when you listen to this bit, they tell you, is how they start to postulate that this is really the way the brain works. The brain works in these bits and fragments.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the IBM Information Machine. And the Information Machine is just that, a machine designed to help me give you a lot of information in a very short time. It can help us look at things more closely than we normally do. It can pick out and give special emphasis to things we often take for granted. Or it can offer a broad perspective of morning in Manhattan. in much the same way as your mind gets it, in fragments and glimpses, sometimes relating to the same idea or incident, like making toast in the morning. Here's another example. Each screen shows one aspect of the notion road race. That's how the information machine works. Now, this is how we would like to use it. So I'll show you some examples of problems.
Now, well, it
that
seemed
are very
impossibly
complex.
slow, but at the time it seemed just like impossibly fast, you know, that there was like more that you could absorb. But this idea that somehow this was, your brain was this computer that was designed to go and absorb information from multi-sources. And again, around this time you start to see more and more of these images of these spaces which are made by screens, and those screens basically extend into the world in all these different ways. You know, the famous war room for Dr. Strangelove, where basically the whole world can be contained in one room. Or, you know, the kind of simple security desk where an entire building can be surveilled from one position. And so the kind of number of screens start to imply, again, a power, a kind of ability to penetrate space in this interesting way. And then there's a whole series of experiments. You know, typically, World's Fairs always love multiple screens because, you know, it's kind of the future. It's always the future. And in '68 in Montreal, these crazy spaces where, you know, you had one screen on the floor and one screen on a wall, and then everybody stood in this gallery and watched these two movies at once. Or there's a film called Into the Labyrinth, where it was a 5-screen film where it would go back and forth between being a kind of contiguous image, and then that would break up, and you'd have kind of one story going on top of another story. You know, so you'd have to be able to go and you know, kind of focus in on one thing while another story happens at the same time. Or the Circularama, which was a kind of 360-degree screen. Or here the Czech Pavilion, where it had kind of choose your own adventure, where the film would stop and then this woman would come out and say, like, what do you want to happen next? And then people would vote, and then the film would go on again, you know. And, or these kind of broken screens with projections in them. So they're all different ways to experiment with what the screen could do and the kind of expansion of it. But in some ways, just the multiple screen itself is an image, and that relationship between information and power, where the more screens you have, the more powerful you are. You're surrounded in this cockpit of information, you know, that you control basically everything from one point. And that's played out again in Minority Report in a very physical way, where you know, Cruz basically has a screen which he can manipulate totally just by moving his arms, and he's surrounded by kind of imagery which his body basically manipulates.
I show 8 how marks in the district, sorted by race and age.
But I think that to end this chapter, that this interesting thing happens, and the next project I'll show you is Doug Aitken's piece, Sleepwalker from Oklahoma. And the first piece I'll show you is the linear version of it, which is 6 stories which are told simultaneously. But he cut a linear version. In an urban space where all of the stories actually are stories in themselves on different surfaces of buildings. And so while that piece is narrative in the sense you cut one thing to another, in this piece would really, you get your mobility that makes the edit. And so it starts to reunite this idea of the kind of multi-screen and mobility. So now the viewer is basically moving through space again, and you're turning your body, and you're looking at these things, and all of these fragmented screens are brought together, again, kind of finding unity in the passerby. So in the final chapter here, this window shopping, this idea of the multiple frame then starts to become a kind of ubiquitous trope about everything. So from everything like, this is a film Time Code, which was shot basically 4 simultaneous films running in real time at the same time. So you had this kind of film experience where the viewer has to go and figure out what to pay attention to. So this is the configuration of the film, and all stories are happening simultaneously. I'm not going to go into it too deeply, but the screen inside the screen is so familiar to us now. Like every news broadcast is always backed up by multiple screens in the background doing things. Or my favorite is the guys in the upper left where they're hanging out with their screen. Or like people talk to screens in space, so they have this kind of weird relationship. Where they have this kind of long distance, short distance thing. You can talk anywhere in the world if the screen comes down and you have a screen that contains another person in it. And the next piece I'll show you is a piece by this guy's Emergency Broadcast Network. And they did it in the 90s, right at the beginning of kind of explosion of cable television, where you had multiple information screens within your TV screen.
Unbelievable. I said multi-channel, multi-billion-dollar satellite transmission with 500 channels. There's too much television. We watch a lot of television. I have to put a word in favor of television. There should be multimedia entertainment information. Digitized television broadcast signal up to satellite and down through a dish.
That's a very long piece, but so there's kind of like multiplication, more and more stuff within stuff, with a condensing of more information in it. And of course, that's paralleled by what we work with every day, right? So this is Xerox PARC in the 1970s, licensed by Apple. It's Apple Lisa, and then in terms of the full screen within screen within screen trope of the desktop. And so this idea of the screen contains screens, that each screen is a way to go into another place. And so the mentality of all these frame spaces becomes second nature. And it starts to move to the full dream. Here's Wall-E in 2008, where you have mobility, you can float around, but you have the screen also. So the screen kind of floats in front of your face. You have screens within screens, but then you're also moving too. And that's played out obviously with the thing that we have in our pockets all the time now. And if you look at this, this is an early thing for Zoom, which was Microsoft's early MP3 player. And it was a web-based piece but I think the image is interesting, which is you have the phone or thing here, and then you're pushing again in that Z dimension through space. So you have mobility plus screen. So the two things that come together with the phone brings those two things together, and you have this kind of imaginary space that you're pushing into, and the whole thing, the screen always stays constant in it. And that idea of mobility plus screen obviously is what motivates Apple with the whole development of the but I think the important thing is that it doesn't, the whole thing about mobility and freedom and motion and not the screen anymore. The thing is, it's with you all the time. And the next thing I'm going to show you is a piece by these Dutch guys who have a product called Lair, which is the kind of augmented reality idea. And I think the interesting thing to watch in this piece is look at the position of the screen in relationship to the mobile viewer.
Augmented reality is a new mass media. It's where the real world is combined with digital information.
You gotta bring these digital experiences into reality. And you gotta engage into reality with this new medium.
days later, you can experience history, art.
ATM finder, real estate for sale. How things looked 10 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. Foursquare, Twitter, tourism, sports, commerce, gaming, social. Gaming in augmented reality is a completely new genre. Interacting with objects right in front of you. You know, we got crazy shit on there.
But I think it's so interesting, these people are kind of walking through the city with the screen in front of them, you know, so it becomes not a broadcast device, but a kind of filter. In this way that you know, the screen, again, now it's flopped again, where it's mobility, it's screen, it's personal, but now it has this other element too, which is this kind of transparency. You know, and I think that you know, that there's a lot of kind of development this idea of the transparent screen, right, as a
trying to understand it crawl its way into my heart.
And I think what's interesting in this scene is the way that the screen is actually a medium between two people, rather than a broadcast device.
Not just arm. It's a terrible privilege.
But you can control it.
Because I would come.
It's different.
Hey, I read all about your accident. That much gamma exposure.
So this idea of this information that's in there, and somehow it's a two-way process now. It's not one way. And so you kind of, that's the kind of concluding point where, you know, now this idea, the screen becomes small, but it becomes also transparent. And so this idea of the passing through becomes the main idea. So back to then Kanye. Because it all has to go back to Kanye somehow. You know, if we look at that trajectory of what we're doing, where, you know, when we're thinking about books and we're thinking about even the early spatial experience, we're always thinking about mobility. And when a mobility in a book is you're moving forward through it all the time. You know, you're kind of imagining one page after another, like that film I showed you in the beginning, where we're really thinking about the narrative organization of forms. This idea of a kind of simultaneous organization of information becomes something different in the way that we moved it. And so we started with this project and basically thinking about what would be the space where something would happen. And what was interesting about that was that we had to design a space before we could design the media. And so to think about what the 7-screen space would be like, so first to draw it, but then to start to really calculate what do you see from where you're at. And so, you know, you're a fixed audience, but you have to move, you have to look at different parts, you have to kind of concentrate on different things. But then you have to think about, if we're going to make a movie, that movie has to match where those screens are exactly. And so we, at first, you know, we kind of just made that really kind of rough form just in the studio with small projectors and boards, so you could start to really kind of figure out what the immersion would be like. And that kind of real-time modeling allows you to imagine the space in a certain way, and to imagine how you can read the space and what you need to know and don't need to know for how it works. And then to kind of take that and start to really imagine, well, what is the envelope itself? But then the interesting reverse design problem is that we had to then design a camera that would shoot for that space, right? So the cinematographers then are building a camera that matches exactly to what the configuration of the space would be. But that's not that everything in the film is you know, all 7 screens at once, because a lot of it is actually montage. But for the shots that you want, where you really want to be completely surrounded by something, to do that, you need a camera to do that. And so, then we went off to the desert in Doha to make this film, and with these kind of crazy contraptions to shoot everything at once. And then also to devise a playback system so that you could watch basically what you were shooting and imagine how that would be ultimately in the theater. So we had kind of small setup to do that and kind of to look at 7 things simultaneously and understand what you're getting, basically. And then we had to design a space, and so sort of going there to, that's a symbol for Rockefeller Records, unless you're not a record fan. And so, you know, could that basically generate a form? That form becomes a theater that you're surrounded by. You have huge speakers under it, so you're basically like kind of bouncing on the chairs that's going on. And then that becomes a form for Cannes last year in Cannes Film Festival. So that basically that elevated pyramid holds this structure, and then the red carpet entrance to it. So, it's actually bright red inside also. So, but you have this space where we elevated the pyramid so you could see through to the Mediterranean, and you can see the theater coming out from underneath it, basically in this highly illuminated space, where you have like this kind of thing that you're watching where you can't see it all at once. You can't, and there's parts in the film where there's a conversation, for instance, between a father and daughter, one speaking on one screen and one on the other, so you're kind of in between two people speaking, and you have to kind of move back and forth between them. And then you have also just the physical space of these kind of huge screens that are around you, and how that works as a visual space as well. And then so then basically we shot this movie, and the soundtrack is like a half-an-hour movie. And so I'm going to show you a couple minutes of it, and of course the most important part of all of which is the photo opportunity, because it has to become something that could be represented in the media, so it becomes a kind of symbol in itself. So, but to conclude, I'll show you just like 3 minutes in the beginning, and it's not released, so I'd really appreciate it if you don't make films of it while it's happening and send them out on Instagram.